Hola, bienvenidos a otro podcast de las charlas de Ático. Soy Fernando, editor de Ático de los libros, y hoy pues tenemos el inmenso placer de estar aquí con Victoria Bateman, hablando pues de esta auténtica maravilla de libro brillante, literalmente brillante, de Económica, una historia global de mujeres, riqueza y poder. Es realmente pues la primera historia económica del mundo que cuenta la economía y el papel fundamental que han desempeñado las mujeres en el mundo y en la construcción de la prosperidad del mundo. Victoria Bateman, pues estoy seguro de que muchos la conocéis, ha ejercido la docencia en Oxford y Cambridge, es directora de estudios de Economía y también pues profesora de Historia Económica pues, en ambas universidades, entre otros muchos cargos. Autora, además de Económica, es autora de Naked Feminism y también de Sex Factor. Y bueno, pues ha colaborado habitualmente y continúa colaborando habitualmente con medios pues, de gran prestigio, como por ejemplo The Guardian, The Telegraph, Bloomberg. Han hecho perfiles de ella, The Times, el Daily Mail. Y bueno, pues también es la historiadora económica y cabecera de producciones de la BBC y también de productoras de televisión. Además, pues bueno, normalmente en Reino Unido cuando tienen que llamar a una historiadora económica, pues la llaman a ella porque es una gran experta. Y bueno, pues ya sin más dilación, damos la bienvenida a Victoria Bateman. Victoria, it's a pleasure having you
Oh, it's so
here today.
exciting to be with you and to be surrounded by
Really
Económica.
beautiful. Yeah. So the first question, I mean, you have such an interesting and fascinating background because you have both the study of the history, the study of the economics, the history of women history. So that's a really nice and particular mix. Why?
So, do you know, I've always been a huge fan of global histories, you know, the sweep of history, and in particular, drawing lessons for the present day. You know, history is this testing ground from which we can learn how to move forward. But when it comes to the history of the economy, it's been written by men, for men, about men. Yeah. And so I really wanted to write a global economic history that, you know, for the first time puts women at the heart of the story, to show that, you know, women have been movers and shakers of economic history, that women have determined the wealth and the poverty of nations.
That's it. And also, like, I would like to ask you, the second question is, like, what's the reader going to find in Económica when they open it and say, okay, what's in here?
Yeah. So I would say that history, in economic terms, is one long story of rise and decline. It's the story of one civilization after another, building great wealth, achieving so much, before ending in a ditch ready to be found by archaeologists centuries or millennia down the line. But you cannot tell that story of rise and decline without women. And I would say...
Half of the population, I mean, 50%.
Half of the population, that is right. And I would say if there is one message at the heart of this book, it is that virtually every successful civilization in history has been one where women were at the heart of the economy. But virtually every civilizational collapse has been preceded by a process of rolling back women's rights, you know, restricting women's freedoms. And I think that, you know, there's a lot we can learn from that if we want to stay at the top of the economic league tables today. We need to avoid repeating that mistake that was made by so many civilizations in the past.
So that's really an original view of the decline and fall of civilizations. I've never listened to it before.
Yeah.
So that's up to you. I mean.
Oh, well, you know, when I think certainly historians for a long time have written about rise and decline, you know, whether it's rise and decline of the Roman Empire, the collapse of the Bronze Age, the rise of Spain, and the stagnation that followed the Golden Age. When you think about China, India, the Middle East, I mean, these were parts of the world that dominated the global economy for millennia. And Europe was poor. Europe was the periphery. And so again, you know, how did China, India, and the Middle East go from having immense wealth, from being at the heart of the global economy, to then suffering stagnation and decline. So, historians have written a lot about these things, and there tend to be, the things they tend to focus on revolve around things like environmental degradation, changes in the climate that perhaps affect the fertility of the soil, and with it the success of the economy. Things like growing bureaucracies, inflated bureaucracies that suck the life out of the economy. So that there are lots of interesting ideas out there as to what explains rise and decline. But women tend to be missing from those explanations, and women are one half of the story. So I think by putting that, story of rise and decline alongside the repeated rise and decline in women's rights, actually, I think we can learn a lot. Because, I would say often when we think about women's rights and history, we perhaps have a misinterpretation of the past. We imagine that women's rights have been on an upward trend, that women's rights were absolutely terrible in the past, and then they advanced, onwards and upwards. But actually that's sad. That's not the way it was. As I show in the book, there were many early civilizations. If we think about, say, the ancient Egyptians, where women could own property, they could own land, they could start their own businesses, they could divorce their husbands. Ancient Egypt, in many ways quite modern and quite advanced in terms of women's rights. If we think about, say...
Or, for example, in Egypt, they took part in the pyramid building?
Exactly.
Okay.
So one of my favourite archaeological findings, and there's a lot of archaeology that goes in this book, because it goes back through millennia, not just centuries. It goes all the way back to the Stone Age. So I've had to draw a lot on findings from archaeology, but one of my favourite findings is that in the for the building of the Great Pyramids at Giza, this was an immense building project. It took decades, it took thousands of workers. And so for the building of the pyramids, you had to build whole workers' villages where people would live. And they had their own cemeteries. And the workers' cemetery there, one half of the burials were for women. So is there no better evidence that women were there alongside men working to build the pyramids? So
what kind of work were they done?
What kind of work? So, on the one hand, you might think that they were perhaps working within the home, cooking and providing for their husbands, but actually they were doing much more than that. So they were, producing food and cloth for the workforce. They were mixing mortar on building sites, but there's also some evidence that women were doing more strenuous work as well. So when you look at the skeletal remains in the workers' cemetery, there's some evidence that women were doing some of the hard labour, as well as the supportive tasks as well. It certainly goes to show that when you look at the past, there were some parts of the world where, women really did, really were actively involved in the workforce and were considered pretty equal to men, actually.
Yeah, for example, like talking about archaeology and the equality of the job, kind of jobs that women did. Like, for example, one of the most fascinating discoveries you've done in this book is like talking about the Stone Age and about the hunters, the game hunters. When one thinks about Stone Age hunters, do you think like a really great, big, enormous man
with a club.
But what have you discovered in that respect?
Oh, do you know? I really wanted to start the book in the Stone Age because our understanding of the Stone Age casts such a shadow over modern day discussions about gender.
Because we think about the Stone Age is the natural way.
Man the hunter.
Yeah, and also like the natural way of our brain.
We do.
If we have like erroneous ways of seeing like a Stone Age. I mean, that's like really perverse on the way we see like the present too.
Yeah, well, those that fight against feminism today, I think they often see the pursuit of gender equality as being like anti-human evolution. You know, people, there are some, I think, who have a more misogynistic, more sexist take on society, who say, you know, men and women are different. Men are the kind of active agents, the providers, and women are these, more passive creatures, and that all goes back to the Stone Age because men were the hunters, and so we can't, to fight for equality is to fight human evolution. It's to fight, thousands of years of human history. And so in the book, I really wanted to go back to the Stone Age, look at the most recent archaeological evidence, and what is really stunning is how we can now challenge that idea of man the hunter. And, a lot of this evidence is really very recent. So my Stone Age chapter begins with, in 2018, in Peru, high up in the Peruvian Andes, there was a discovery of a burial of a great hunter. And this hunter was buried with a 24-piece hunting toolkit with some pointed stone tools that could be attached to a stick and thrown at animals. To catch and kill animals for food, the sustenance within the community. And when this burial was first discovered, the assumption was it was a male hunter, because archaeologists have long assumed if you find a skeleton buried with hunting tools or with weapons, that it must be a man, because we have this image of man the hunter and man the warrior. And so actually, until relatively recently, no one checked the science of the DNA or the bones or the teeth to see. The assumption was it was a man. And of course that then seemed to add support to the vision of man the hunter, because you find bodies, you assume they're men, and that then supports the idea of man the hunter. But what happened in 2018 with this discovery is they scientifically tested the bones, the teeth, and what they found was this was a woman. This was a female hunter, a really respected prize hunter. And archaeologists gave her a name, WMP6.
What a nice name.
It sounds very mathematical. WMP6, it stands for Willamea Pacha, because Willamea Pacha is the archaeological date, like the place of the Willamea Pacha individual 6. It's like the sixth body found. WMP6. It's not very catchy, but the local people there, when it attracted journalists from across the world, because journalists were stunned that this was a woman, 9,000-year-old female hunter. The journalists came and so attracted a lot of attention to this part of Peru. And so the local people gave this hunter a new name, Wara Wara, and that translates as star. Because she became like the star of the international press. But she was also a star 9,000 years ago through her hunting, providing for her local community. So I think, all the way back in the Stone Age, women were doing the same kinds of things that men were doing, hunting alongside men, providing for their community. And I think with that, we can lift that shadow. We can confront that idea of man the hunter, show that, women have always been at the heart of the economy.
Because Wara Wara is not anecdotal. I mean, she wasn't alone. You talk there was like 40% of hunter-gatherers were like, of hunters were like female.
Were female, exactly. So I think really in part because of that discovery in 2018 and because of this real shocking revelation that this was a female rather than a male hunter, what's happened is archaeologists have looked back at, previous discoveries of hunters' burials from the Stone Age in the Americas. And what they have now found is 40% of bodies,
equal, I mean,
have been shown to be female. So, yes, it's I think it's such an important piece of evidence, and so that's really where the book begins and then moves forward from there.
But also like focusing on the kind of things that are supposed to be done by male, but that also then by female. We forget that some of the things that people like attribute to women are also like key, like in like building like the world economy. Like for example, in the Neolithic Revolution, which was like the role, what like the women, like the inventors of the Neolithic Revolution. Can we dare to say that?
So yes, the Neolithic Revolution. So the time when we went from being hunter-gatherers to settling down in one place, on a patch of land, building a home, perhaps having a pet dog.
Maybe.
And with a community around you. I mean, so we're talking about what, 10,000 years ago. And this this revolution that happened, and really starting in the Middle East, in the cradle of civilization in the Middle East. And I think, often we think, in the way that we think of men, the hunter, we think of man, the farmer, man as having brought about that first big revolution in history, the invention of farming. But actually, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how much, there are so many things I could say. Let me begin by first of all saying, and economic history is written on women's bodies, the bodily remains of women throughout history. And so one of the things that I find really fascinating is if you look at some of these early farming communities, and you look at the evidence from the bones, the human remains, one thing that is really quite striking is that it's women's remains that show the evidence of their involvement in grain, so in the grinding of grain in particular. And growing grain, but then grinding grain, to make grain edible. So if I might demonstrate. So you imagine what it took to transform grain into flour, which you could then cook into bread, which was the bedrock of the diet in Neolithic times. So you would have to get on your hands and knees, and you imagine a pestle and a mortar, so a big stone and something. You spread out your grain, and then with your stone, you have to, you're rubbing the grain, and so through that action, you're grinding it down into flour. Now you imagine that the muscles here, and on your knees here, the wear and tear that it creates. And did you know that it took about 3 hours, 3 hours of this constant action, grinding grain, to produce enough flour to feed, an average family. So we know from the skeletal remain, from the burial remains of women, that it was women that were doing this hard work, providing food for their families. But I think, more than that, I think, the evidence goes beyond that. And often when we think about farming, we just think of food, early farming, we think of food. But do you know that actually the production of anything that we could use to make cloth was just as important? Because at the time of the Neolithic, there had been quite dramatic changes in the climate. And also, woolly mammals, that provided fur to make, clothing. They were being hunted to extinction. And so there was this change in the climate. We needed something to protect ourselves from wet weather, for example. And so actually the question was, not only how can we provide food, but how can we provide cloth? And so I think what's really fascinating is a lot of these, first farming communities, it was about the production of, say, wool that could be used to produce cloth. So about domesticating livestock, not just for the meat, but so that we could produce cloth. So animals were not just walking larders,
No.
They were walking wardrobes.
Yeah.
And, cloth was something that, the production of cloth really was dominated by women. And again, we know that from their burials, because women tended to be buried with the equipment associated with, spinning and weaving.
Yeah.
So actually, there's a lot more going on in the Neolithic that revolves around women's lives and what women were doing for the economy, I think.
And going back to clothes, I mean, clothes was not only like to dress yourself. I mean, it was also like the first global coinage. So that's an important role women also played on that sphere.
Yeah, that is right. I mean, yes, cloth, the power of cloth in human history, it's not just something that has been used to make, pretty skirts and, smart suits. Cloth was in many ways the first form of money. And this was particularly important, of course, for trade, for buying and selling all things across the economy. And I would say probably the first big trade boom in history was the Bronze Age. So now we're looking about 5,000 years ago, something like that, when humans started to take, copper and
Bronze
tin.
Age is more or less Egypt, Mesopotamia as that age, more or less.
So very much associated with the rise of the Egyptian civilization, the rise of the Mesopotamian civilization. So 3000 BC, 2000 BC, up to the Bronze Age. There was a big collapse at the end of the Bronze Age, which was about 1200 BC. So we're looking at the second and the third millennium BC. And so, why was there, the first big trade boom of human history then? Because people had to go and search for tin. So for example, go all the way to Afghanistan, for example, to bring tin back to the Middle East, the cradle of civilization, to then mix with copper from, say, the Turkish copper mines to produce bronze. And bronze was a transformative substance. I mean, in a way, it's like AI is today. AI is transforming technological possibilities for the economy. And bronze did that 5,000 years ago. So, for example, it enabled the production of more complex and harder weapons and tools. So it really transformed the economy. But, and again, often when we think about the people producing the bronze, we think about men, men the hunters, men the farmers, men the bronze producers. But women were producing the cloth that formed the currency of global trade, with which people travelled with this cloth on the side packs of donkeys or camels to go in search of and then to pay for the tin. So cloth was, it was money before the money that we would think of as money today existed. Before silver coins, before banknotes, there was cloth. And I would say that cloth, there were three good reasons really why cloth worked really well as a form of money. So firstly, it's light, it's lightweight, doesn't weigh very much. So you can roll it up and you can take it on your travels. Secondly, by feeling and looking at the cloth, you can judge the quality. And if you're going to use something as a form of exchange, the person who needs to be tempted to accept it from you needs to judge the quality of it. And thirdly, it's non-perishable. So, using food to pay for things, the problem, it works in the short term, but you might not reach it might have gone off. But also the people that are receiving that from you, they might want to store that value. You can put cloth in your, in your storeroom, and you can go back 2 years later, still there, and you can then use it, at a later date. Whereas with food, perhaps if it's cheese, perhaps cheese gets better. But vegetables and bread, I wouldn't want to 2 years on. So cloth was the first form of money for those three reasons. And we know that women were producing cloth. And actually, one of the women cloth producers that I talk about in the book, we know about her. She was a woman called Lamassi. And so she lived around about 2000 BC. And she had a cloth making business in what is today Iraq. And her husband traded her cloth in Turkey. And the reason we know about Lamassi and her cloth making business is that she wrote letters to her husband in Turkey. And those letters have survived.
So she also knew how to read and write.
She knew how to read and write. And at the time, people wrote on clay. So not on paper, but on clay. And what happened was that clay would be left out in the sun. It would harden. And because she wrote on clay, that survived the test of time. I mean, if you write on paper, it might not survive 4,000 years, but papyrus. She wrote on clay. And we can see from the letters that she wrote to her husband that she, for example, sends lists of the cloth that she was shipping to him for him to trade in Turkey on her behalf. But she also sends, family greetings, family news. And at times she's quite tough on her husband. So you can tell in these letters that sometimes they argue. And clearly from one of these letters, he had in a previous letter said to her something like, "I'm not happy with the quality of your cloth that you're sending me." And so she replies in this particular letter that we have, saying, "Who is this man who dare criticize the quality of my cloth? He is not worthy of my home."
No.
So she clearly had a lot of power. And her daughter got involved in the cloth making business as well. We see that from the letters. So Lamassi was just one of many women who were there, not just producing cloth, but running their own cloth making workshops, employing other women at the time to produce the currency, not just of Iraq, but what was at the time the currency of the global economy.
And so I would say that's something that has been historically common, like for example, to have a domestic enterprise, a family-owned business. And I mean, always the face, or sometimes the face is a man. But the truth is that the real ones ruling it are women, and people don't get to know it. So that's really interesting, and you to talk about it in your book too.
It is. Well, I think the really fascinating thing as well is that we think of family businesses as being a historic thing, but actually still today, the majority of businesses are family businesses. Family businesses are the backbone of the economy. The economy wouldn't exist without family businesses. When you think about all of the hard work that is done generation on generation within these family businesses. But you're right that often when you look at the sign above the door, it's Collins and Sons, or Williams and Sons, in Spanish. And that really hides the fact that women, mothers, wives, daughters, have always worked, just as hard as men within family businesses. But, for whether that's for social reasons or whether for legal reasons, because of course in so many societies, women haven't had the right to, sign contracts. And so legally the firm is, in contractual terms, is owned by, the men of the family. But actually, behind the scenes, women were working just as hard. And I think one really nice piece of evidence of that is, and we see this from, business directories going back hundreds of years, is how many widows took on the business after the death of their husband. And I think the fact that throughout history, widows have stepped in and taken on the business after the, sad death of their husband. To be able to do that and do it successfully, you had to be involved beforehand. So I think the evidence is there if we look for it.
And so one really great feature of your book is you don't only go into the abstract. I mean, you go so deep into examples that kind of rejuvenate, resuscitate bring to life like the lives of those women like in the past, and that's so interesting because it's like really easy to write a book on history and make it dry, but you have managed not to do it. And
thank you. I mean, human stories, you know, and I mean there are so many remarkable female inventors, traders, entrepreneurs, bankers, writers, you know, and so I really wanted to tell the story of these women. And, you know, this is one book. I could have written 20 volumes on the lives of these women. And I think, you know, when I first started to write the book, I worried, you know, could I find enough women to fill these pages? And by the time I'd finished writing it, I could have written 20 volumes. So, you know, there are so many remarkable women, and I really hope that, you know, everyone can find an example of someone who perhaps is like themselves, you know, some characteristics like themselves, that they can feel that they're reaching out across the centuries, across the millennia, and they see themselves in these women from history. And, you know, certainly I think when we think...
Is it like your favorite character?
There are so many.
You have to pick one.
If I had to pick one, it changes day by day. Day by day. But I'll give you one and then perhaps another. So Priscilla Wakefield. So Priscilla Wakefield was a writer. She lived in Georgian Britain, so the late 1700s. She was born in the middle of the 1700s. Do you watch period dramas at all? Do you watch Bridgerton? Bridgerton. So I want you to think of Bridgerton. So I want you to think of women in beautiful dresses, in bonnets or hats. You know, she was a woman from that era, the era of Bridgerton. And she was a writer, and in fact, you know, her husband was in business. He was a businessman, but he wasn't very successful. You know, his business was on the verge of bankruptcy. So she had to write in order to support herself, her children, her grandchildren. She wrote 17 books, but she wasn't just a writer. She set up Britain's first bank for women and children. And she did that in 1798. So providing financial services for women and children. And in fact, her bank accounts were so popular that men knocked on her door and said, can you look after our savings as well? And so she extended her bank to open her accounts to men. And that really set off a whole wave that spread banking from, you know, not just the elite class, but to ordinary people across Britain. So Priscilla Wakefield, I think, is one of my favourite examples. I mean, there are also, I mean, in Spanish history, I have so many favourites. So, you know, Priscilla Wakefield, she was a writer, but Ana Caro, the century before Priscilla Wakefield, was writing books. And I know there's recently been an exhibition at the Instituto Cervantes on women writers from the literary golden age of Spain. And I think there are about 30 women writers featured, including Ana Caro. And in that exhibition, you can see the receipts for her writing, you know, so she was being paid for her book. So she was supporting herself financially through her writing. So she is definitely another of my favorites. I mean, women, you know, at the time when the printing press was spreading out, at the time when publishing was first starting, women were turning that into a monetary, you know, money-making enterprise. You know, this was really the creative economy of the 17th and the 18th century, and women were getting involved. Women were in there leading the way. I mean, some of my favorites.
Even if they have to write under pseudonyms, like take for example Jane Austen. I mean,
that is true.
Best-selling author, but I mean, she didn't want to reveal her name.
No, that is true. That is true. And so she would write, Sense and Sensibility, which was her first book that she published anonymously. And then later on, her books were published by the author of Sense and Sensibility. But you know, what happened in Britain was, as people started to realise that authors like her were women, then, and in the late 1700s, early 1800s in Britain, 10 of the 12 best-selling novelists were women. Then once actually people began to accept that women were writing, what happened, do you know, you even got men pretending to be women in the hope that they would then, you know, that was the fashion of the time, that they would attract more readers if they pretended to be women. So
it's going all the way around. That's really fun.
Written by a lady.
And maybe he's an old man.
Yeah, exactly. So even men really pretending to be women, because women were being so very successful at the time.
So Jane Austen is like more or less the time of Industrial Revolution, and you have like some really original and groundbreaking theses about the Industrial Revolution that people have always wondered, like, why did the Industrial Revolution took place in Britain, which was
a tiny little island on the edge of Europe? No, absolutely.
Why? I mean, and you have the answer. I mean, people didn't realize.
Absolutely. I mean, Britain, for most of history, has been, you know, really poor. And in fact, Europe, for most of history, was relatively poor because China, India, and the Middle East, these were the wealthiest parts of the world. So how did Britain, that was on the periphery of a region that was itself peripheral to the global economy, become the richest economy in the world in the 19th century? How did it move from poverty to prosperity? Such an important question, because if we can answer that question, doesn't that give, you know, hope and possibility for poor countries today? You know, sadly, there are still so many poor parts of the world, and if Britain was able to rise from poverty to prosperity over the course of, you know, 100 or 200 years, then that, you know, gives hope if we can draw the right lessons from the past. And I think, you know, a lot of people believe that the answer is to be found in empire, you know, that Britain built this empire and colonized the world and that was the root of its riches. I think no. I think no. Exploitation doesn't deliver long-run economic growth. It is liberation that delivers long-run economic growth. And I find, I argue that in particular, it was the freedom of ordinary women in Britain that helped to drive the economy forward. Now, you know, it's when you think about the past, when you think about the 1600s, 1700s in Britain, you don't automatically think this was a great time for women. But when you compare women's lives in Britain at that time with, say, women's lives in China or India or the Middle East, they lived much freer lives. And one piece of evidence of that is the average age at which women got married at that time. Now, at that time in China, India and the Middle East, there was a lot of child marriage. You know, sadly, still in India today, there's a lot of child marriage. So pretty much all women were married by the age of 17 or 18. But in Britain, the average age that women got married was 25 or 26. I mean, remarkably modern age. And we know this for sure. I mean, sometimes people question, you know, wonder, can this really be true? But we know it for sure. We know it for sure because church records are so good. So we know from churches, you know, up and down Britain, you know, from the marriage registers, that yes, women on average did not marry until they were 25 or 26. And before that time, you know, teenage girls went out to work. You know, they left their family home and they went out to work, whether that was, you know, as working on a farm, or whether it was in domestic service, you know, as a servant, or whether it was in the growing number of workshops and factories, you know, producing cloth, for example. So it was normal for teenage girls to go out to work. And because they were through that earning their own money, that is what enabled them to take charge of the marriage decision, you know, to decide for themselves whether, when, and who to marry. So to escape from that practice of child marriage that existed in other parts of the world, And so what happened actually is a good chunk, between about 10 and 15% of women didn't marry at all and lived independent lives. Because women married later, then that meant that they had smaller families. If you're producing children from the age of 16 or 17 versus from the age of 25, you have a much smaller family. And the result was, this I think created 3 or 4 big advantages for the economy. So the first one was, because the average family was smaller, population growth didn't reach the extremes that would undermine the economy, undermine the environment, undermine wages in the economy. And so because population growth was lower, then people were more scarce, workers were more scarce, and that meant that they could demand higher wages. So workers were paid on average more in Britain than they were, say, in China, India, and the Middle East at that time. And because workers were more expensive, businesses had an incentive to mechanize, to not just use people, but to use machines alongside people. And when we think about the Industrial Revolution, we think about machines, we think about technology. So this really is inspiring, incentivizing the technological transformation of the economy. And at the root of that technological transformation is women being able to make their own decisions about marriage. And with it, then, fertility, population growth, helping to support that higher wage, higher innovation economy. And then in addition to that, the fact that women are marrying later and having these smaller families means that the average family could better afford to save and invest. And that helped to provide funds, for the family business, to, again, invest in machines and technology, but also to invest in what, as economists, we call human capital, so to invest in skills. This was a time before free education. So if you wanted your children to learn to read and write or to be trained, you had to pay for it. So if you're a family with, say, 10 children, you can't afford. If you're marrying later, you have a smaller family, there's a greater chance that you can afford to educate your children. And in fact, earlier we mentioned Priscilla Wakefield, the writer, the Georgian writer from the era of Bridgerton, and she wrote 17 books. Most of those books were for homeschooling, so that people could buy books and teach themselves, learn to read and write and learn about the world. So, but the other thing is that I do think that when women go out to work and earn their own, way in the world, that challenges political structures that are authoritarian, that are dictatorial. Because really at the root of dictatorship is patriarchy within the home. So, if within the home women are brought up to obey, then, as a society, we learn to obey. We don't learn to question, to hold our rulers to account, to protest, to have our voices heard. So, for the development of democracy, what you need is within the home, people to be standing up to the patriarchy, people being brought up to question rather than to shut up. And so I do think that as women challenge patriarchal systems within the home, they're at the same time sowing the seeds for democracy.
So let's dwell on patriarchy. Would you say patriarchy is a thing from forever, or does it have like a starting point, and when would it be?
So I think, with the rise and decline of civilizations, patriarchy has gone up and down throughout history. You could go back to, say, Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, and the cloth producer Limasi, who was running her own business and producing cloth, in 2000 BC. But then what happened about 300 years later was King Hammurabi. King Hammurabi, the famous, I mean, he features in the Bible, doesn't he, King Hammurabi? And he introduced probably the first legal system of patriarchy. So a guardianship system in which women became the property of men. Women became the property of their husbands or their fathers. And that really kind of constrained what women could do, because legally, if as a woman you do not exist, you can't sign contracts. So you can't set up your own business, you can't buy and sell anything other than, cheap, small, cheap things. So King Hammurabi has a lot to answer for. But I would say patriarchy, it's gone up and down throughout history.
Just like the most striking civilization that once was like more or less not so patriarchal, and then went fully patriarchal. And what's the most striking?
One of the most striking. So, patriarchy can work in different ways. Patriarchy looks different in different periods of history and in different parts of the world. So one of the examples that I talk about in the book is China. And in China, historically women were, the people who produced the silk for the Silk Road that connected the Far East and Europe. And the Chinese state had a motto, and that was men plough and women weave. And Chinese taxes historically were paid in grain and also in cloth, in silk. So, Chinese women, so important historically in the Chinese economy. But what happened over time was that families found a way of trying to extract the value that women were creating. And that was through binding women's feet. And so, little girls would have their feet broken, turned in, bound. And what this did was to render, from a young age, women immobile, geographically immobile. They couldn't leave the family home and, go and get a job and earn their own money or start their own business. They had to live a life within the home, because with such tiny feet, moving was really painful. You can't go very far, very fast. And so, this was a social practice, a kind of patriarchal social practice that developed at the level of families that allowed male patriarchs to then essentially, it's like enslaving your daughters so that you can then effectively chain them to the spinning wheel. You don't need a chain because you've bound their feet. So where are you going to go? And so foot binding was a way that the patriarchy managed to extract the value that women created through cloth. And it took until the 20th century, really, for that practice to be brought to an end. And I think what's really interesting is, through the communist revolution in China, there was a real understanding that unless you abolish this practice, then you lack the economic power of half of your population.
It's obvious. So, for example, China was, as you said, like one civilization in which like women had an important economical role, and then eventually it was taken from her, and the civilization like declined. I would say maybe that's also a reason for the decline of the Roman civilization.
You're so right. And in the book, I talk about both the rise and the fall of the Roman world, and I put women into that story, inject women into that story. And I think, when you look at the rise of Italy, in that, we're talking about that first millennium BC. I think what was really striking to me was how relatively free women were in in the Roman world compared with, say, ancient Athens at the time
how
in
things
Greece.
like, for example, in ancient Athens?
Oh, so in ancient Athens, the guardianship system, instituted by King Hammurabi, hundreds of years before, there was a really strict guardianship system in ancient Athens.
So if you had to compare, for example, ancient Athens to a modern day society, which one?
I think it would be quite close to Afghanistan.
Wow.
I'm going to say that controversially.
Wow.
But not only were women expected to stay within the home, they had to cover their hair.
Wow.
And so the most ancient depictions of the Greek equivalent of Venus, Aphrodite, the most ancient depictions of Aphrodite, she's veiled, she's clothed. Of course,
crazy.
A little later on, she uncovers her, her body, and the Romans really ran with the idea of a naked Venus, didn't they? I mean, the Roman women were renowned for their beautiful hairstyles. They didn't have to veil. And in fact, I was in the Prado Museum, and there's a wonderful sculptured walkway of sculptures of Roman heads of men and women. And the way that archaeologists date the Roman women is through the hairstyle. So unlike Athenian women, Roman women could uncover their hair. And I think that is in some ways, a sign of the freedom. Roman women were free to start businesses. They traded, wine and olive oil across the Mediterranean. And in fact, in the book, I talk about a trader called Celia from Roman times. And she traded Spanish wine and Spanish olive oil across the Mediterranean. Yes, and her mother did the same. So this is a multi-generational family of women traders in Roman times. So yes, I mean, in many ways, quite well. I'm not saying women's rights were perfect in Rome, and there were times when women really had to fight to maintain their rights.
Because you talk about like political infighting on this book too.
Yeah.
Like women demonstrating because
women demonstrating, that's right, in the Roman Forum to maintain their rights. So during the time that Rome was fighting Carthage, so Carthage, I mean, it's one of my favorite trading empires of history, because the trading empire of Carthage, and of course Spain was a part of that maritime empire. This was an empire of equals. This was a commercial empire. This wasn't about a crazy kind of political, power-driven, dictatorial-driven empire. This was an empire of equals that was about trade, peaceful trade across the Mediterranean. And, this, Carthage, this was a big competitor in the early rise of the Romans. And famously, of course, Hannibal travelled up through Spain and across the Alps to confront the Romans. And Hannibal was he worried that Rome was going too far, and he wanted to defend the freedoms of the Mediterranean. And during the wars with Carthage, the Roman state decided to try to restrict women's freedoms. And its argument was that this was to support the war effort. So, for example, it limited how much women could spend in the economy. It limited women's ability to move around in carriages, so like take taxis. Yeah. It limited the types of clothes that women could wear. So they had to wear more simple clothes, not luxurious clothes. And the Roman state argued that this was all as part of the war effort. The problem was, once the wars with Carthage ended, those restrictions continued. And certainly, so Cato, the famous Roman statesman, said we need to maintain these restrictions on women's spending because it will stop women being in a spending competition with one another. That women can't be trusted to make decisions about their own money. So what happened was that Roman women gathered together in the Roman Forum and they protested. They protested to get back the right to spend, and they won. So this is a couple of hundred years BC. And so every time as a woman you go on a shopping spree, you can thank that protest in Rome, 200 BC, roughly. So women, they had to fight to maintain their freedoms, but they did. They were successful. But what then subsequently happened, and now I'm talking about 2,000 years ago, really starting with the Emperor Augustus, a time when the Roman Empire was expanding, when the economy was going full steam ahead. Women, as I say, there at the heart of the economy, spending and trading. And I think that much as in modern day society, people, perhaps more conservative people, started to worry about falling fertility rates, about some women choosing not to marry, doing business instead of marrying, and also about immigration. So can you believe it? 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire was in a moral panic about immigration and was worried that immigration was spoiling Roman culture. And so Emperor Augustus decided that the solution to these supposed societal problems was to force women into the home, to encourage Roman women to breed for the good of Rome. Because if Roman women did less paid work, less business work, and instead retreated into the home, got married younger, had more children, then Rome wouldn't need all of the immigration. and that this would be, this would help preserve Roman culture and be good for Rome. And, we can see, looking back in history, constraining the rights and freedoms of half of your population, women, it didn't turn out well for the Roman world. If we repeat that today, it won't turn out well for us.
The same thing will happen.
The same thing will happen. And, we face these same, we're having the same discussions as a society that the Romans were having, about falling fertility rates, about women choosing not to get married, about immigration, the same things we are talking about today. And how we respond to those things, which direction we go in, will determine the future fate of our civilization today. Whether we end up on the scrap heap of history like the Romans, or whether we build on the success that we've had.
Because can we take current women rights for granted?
We absolutely cannot. And I think we see that in Spain, don't we? I mean, we see how women's right to control their fertility, how recently in history, 2013, 2014, that it was under threat. And I know that, feminists have had to work really hard in order to secure women's rights to control their own fertility. We see also in terms of, the rights of women who monetize their bodies, as well as their brains, that those rights are under threat, that women who perhaps use their bodies are seen as, as harlots, as sinners, and are disrespected by society. And some people are pushing, to deny them the same rights and freedoms that women in general have. So I think, we look at Trump America. We look there at, the backlash against working women. We look at the trad wife movement. We look at the manosphere, the rise of these misogynistic male influencers that have this narrative that it is men that build, invent, and maintain society. And I honestly think that if we want to stand up to that misogyny in the modern day, that history can be our greatest weapon. Because if we can show, and this is what I show with Economica, if we can show that you cannot build a successful civilization without women, but that also that throughout history, economic collapses, civilizational collapses have always followed constraints on women, then today, then you can open your eyes, you can remove the blinkers, you can see that if we repeat that same mistake, then the future will be one of poverty, not of prosperity. So let history be our greatest ammunition. I mean, if you tell history right, you have what you need to stand up to modern day misogyny.
And also going back to Rome, we've been like talking a bit about Rome before. For example, like the ceiling that the Roman had, they were like an exploitation economy, so as to say, and eventually even the women became exploited.
Yeah.
So how, can you really build like prosperity, long-term prosperity out of exploitation, or do you need another thing?
Yeah, I mean, exploitation has been one of those things that has dominated human history, hasn't it? I mean, from the beginning of human history right the way through today. I mean, people have exploited those around them, and then they've gone out into the world, they have colonized, they have built empires. Spain did it, Britain did it, the Mesopotamians did it, the medieval Middle East, the Mongols, in China. I mean, colonization, empire, exploitation has been a theme throughout history. But the type of, modern day prosperity that we have today is, it's relatively rare. And so I don't think that exploitation is what explains modern day prosperity. Exploitation has existed for much longer than modern day prosperity. So I think actually it is the opposite of exploitation that drives economic growth. It is liberation. Okay. It is individuals being free to make their own choices about their lives. And I think particularly, economic freedoms. And what do I mean by economic freedom? It is the freedom to make your own choices about how you work, the nature of your work. Yeah. So, in China, where women were having their feet bound, they had no choice about the type of work. And so if you didn't like making cloth, or if you had a really innovative business idea, you couldn't go out and pursue it. Yeah. And that was bad for you. And it was bad for the economy as a result. So the ability to make your own decisions about work, but then also the ability to keep the rewards from that work, rather than have, your family patriarchy or a patriarchal state, extract those rewards by whether that's through, enslaving you, or whether that's through something like foot binding that basically imprisons you within your own home. Or the practice of, the religious practice of seclusion, where women had to, stay within their own home in order to be seen as respectable, and that, limited what the nature of their work and their ability to monetize their work. But also the freedom to, once you've made your own money, the freedom then to decide how you spend it, and the freedom to save and invest it. So those basic economic freedoms are freedoms that it's so easy to take for granted, I think, in a modern day country like Spain or like Britain. But actually, we shouldn't take for granted. And, they're extremely powerful. And I think if more women across the world had access to that set of economic freedoms, the world would be a radically different place. It would be a much more prosperous place, and it would be a much happier place.
What happens, like, for example, in societies that historically have had like really big population of slave population of course, enslaved women? How that affects like history when those people are eventually freed?
Yeah. I mean, so certainly within the history of the United States, then much like Britain and Spain, there is a horrible history of exploitation in the enslavement of people of African origin, transporting them across the Atlantic to work on plantations, and then women whose children were removed from them and sent to work on other plantations. So family life, as we understand it, that could not exist within this context of this slave economy. And certainly that slave-based economy made a small number of people super rich, plantation owners and so on, and lots of many more people super poor, the enslaved people. And there are some historians who argue that that was at the root is at the root of modern day American prosperity. Now, I disagree, because I think, if there's one thing history shows you, it is that exploiting people can only get you so far. You can work people harder and longer hours in an effort to try and get more and more and more out of those people. But ultimately, once you've pushed them to their limits, where do you go from that? You can't create extra economic growth forever from exploitation and enslavement. What creates long-run economic growth, long-run prosperity, is those, enslaved people instead having liberties, to make their own choices about work. So that rather than being enslaved on a cotton plantation, you can go out into the world. You can, start your own business. You can find a job that might be better suited to your talents or to your preferences, and you have that chance to, build a richer life for yourself, and also with it a richer life for the economy as a whole. The economy is comprised of individuals, and so you cannot make a successful economy unless those individuals are free to make the best use of their talents, to keep the rewards that come from that, which then push us onwards, push us further, push us to do great things and to transform our own lives, and with it our economy.
That possibility to use its own inventiveness. People forget that many important and great invents we have are were developed by women.
That's right.
That's it.
That's right. One of my favorite Spanish inventors, Fermina Orduna, who invented the mobile milking parlor. So that meant that you could put your livestock on the move and take the livestock and then provide fresh milk out there in communities. In some ways a simple idea, but at the same time quite transformational. And then also Candida Moran, who took her, the family olive oil business and industrialized it, with modern methods of oil production, and in order to turn her business into, the family business into this great success. So, and I think actually, when it comes to business, we think about businessmen. In Britain we have this phrase businessman. And we think of business people as being men, wearing suits, carrying briefcases, wearing a hat. And I think in some ways, because we think that business has always just been for men, it's very easy as a feminist to then be anti-business. But actually, when you look back in history and you rescue these business women from history, you see that business actually hasn't been just for men. For every Henry Ford or J.P. Morgan, there was a female equivalent, in business, transforming the economy by driving business forward. And I think certainly if as a society, if we want to maintain the freedoms that we have of an economy, with markets, with trade, with businesses, including family businesses, if we want to, avoid the type of, a more dictatorial economy where the state overreaches and monopolizes and takes charge, then I think that by recognizing, women's contribution to business, then actually it helps us to see that, that business, that trade, that markets provide opportunities for everyone, for women as well as men, and therefore that we need to, I think it helps us to see markets, trade and business in a different light.
I mean, women have been always capital in history. For example, let's think about the Spanish history without women. For example, think about in Mexico, La Malinche. I mean, people always think about Hernán Cortés, which of course was an important role in conquering Mexico, but La Malinche, if the Malinche hadn't been there, I mean, it would have been impossible to conquer Mexico, for example.
Oh, absolutely. And so one of the things, I think, there's always a risk when you punch women into history that you just tell the positive stories of women who drove the economy forward. And, there are lots of women that did that in the book. But I think it's equally as important that we see the women as... women are the drivers of both wealth and poverty, because women are just the same as men. We can be angels, but we can be demons. There is good and bad in all of us, men and women. And so really this isn't just a book about how, women have driven the economy forward. This is a book about how women have been the movers and shakers, both for good and for bad in economic history. How women have determined not just the wealth of nations, but the poverty of nations. For every Henry Ford, there was a female equivalent. For every Genghis Khan and Hernan Cortez, there was a female equivalent in the form of La Malinche. So, a formerly enslaved woman gifted to Hernan Cortez as a slave girl, but who had a real ear for languages, very bright, and who went on to become his chief translator and negotiator, and helped Cortez to really dominate and even we could say colonize, the South Americas on behalf of Spain. So we there are women in the book like Malinche, where the story is really quite complex. But I think, certainly, if as feminists we are to achieve the goal of an equal society, we need to recognize that women have done all kinds of things throughout history, good, bad, and with the grey area in the middle.
So you've taken a look of the whole history of the world. I mean, and we are in the present days. So if you had to bet on the future, it would be an optimistic view of the future or a pessimistic view of the future, especially concerning women's rights, because nowadays they're under attack.
So I'm, naturally I'm an optimistic person, actually. Okay. I'm quite a kind of happy, optimistic person. So I would like to be optimistic about the future. But alarm bells are really ringing in my head right now, because once you see history in this light, once you see this repeated story of rise and decline, and the degree to which rise and decline has been driven by the ups and downs in women's freedoms, it does leave me worried about where we are today, because yes, women's rights we've achieved great things in terms of women's rights, in relatively recent history, but we can't take that for granted. And we know that there is a backlash against women in the present day, as there was in the Roman world, for example. And so which direction, what will the future hold? Will women's rights continue to go forward, or will they be rolled back? I mean, we see what happened in Iran in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, women's rights rolled back. We see in Afghanistan how women's rights have been rolled back. We see in Trump America, women's rights are rolled back. And so there's a lot to fight for. And, in the book, I show women have been protesting, fighting, having their voices heard in order to maintain their freedoms. And so let's keep doing that so that we can avoid repeating the greatest mistake of human history, rolling back women's rights.
That's right. So if you have to give only one reason for the reader to go and read this book, which would be that reason?
Well, not only is it the first economic history of the world to centre women, it gives you the historical ammunition that you need as a modern day feminist to stand up for women's rights. But also, I want this book to be not just a book for women. This is a book for men too.
Of course.
This isn't a book only filled with women, men are also in, Hernan Cortez is in, Henry Ford is in there, JP Morgan. This is an economic history for everyone. I don't want to repeat the mistake that has been made in the past of just talking about women, the equivalent to just talking about men. This is about us all. This is an economic history for everyone.
Yeah. So it's been a pleasure. So absolute pleasure having you today with us. Bueno, pues ha sido un auténtico placer, la verdad, estar hoy hablando con Victoria Bateman y con este libro, bueno, que enseguida publicaremos el lunes siguiente, Económica, una historia global de mujeres, riqueza y poder, la primera historia global del papel de las mujeres en la economía. Esperemos que os haya gustado mucho. So, see you in the next time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.